Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest in the Teleware webinar series. Today, we're going to be asking the question, could millennials be the key to ending the productivity crisis? Hi, my name's Mark Elwood, and I'm the Marketing Director here at Teleware. And I am joined by a fantastic panel today. Firstly, we've got Dr. Lucy Green, who's the CEO and from the Business Development Experts Lerato. Good morning, Lucy.
Good morning. Morning, everyone.
Lucy, could you just do a little brief intro, just tell people a little bit about yourself and the work that Lerato does?
Sure. Thank you. Yes. So Lerato is a business development firm, and we focus on helping technology companies deliver value that matters to buyers. So we do a lot of work aligning supplier propositions with market demands, that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We're also joined today by Vicky Ryder from Microsoft. Good morning, Vicky.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me this morning.
Yeah, thanks and welcome. And welcome as our panelist who's a millennial as well. And last but not least, we're joined by Andrew Fawcett, who's the product manager from Teleware. Hi, Andrew.
Good morning. Definitely not a millennial here.
Yes. So, welcome everybody, and we've had an awful lot of interest in this topic, and no wonder, because by 2025 it's estimated that 75% of the global workforce are going to be millennials, so the millennial generation is going to be dominant, and it's a massively influential demographic, and one that's got very different expectations to how we work and the way that we work than previous generations. Just from our own conversations that we've been having around this, the term millennial can often be seen as quite a negative term, in terms of snowflakes and not wanting to work and so on. But actually, looking myself, just doing research around the topic, there's a number of studies that actually identify that millennials are actually very hardworking and very ambitious. It's just that the way that they work is very different to their predecessors, which can have potentially negative connotations. But I just want to hold that thought for a moment before we delve too far into the working practices of millennials. I want to understand a little bit more about productivity. So, Lucy, I'm going to come to you first around this. So, what are the problems with businesses that are causing productivity to stagnate?
Well, the key thing really is that skill shortages is impacting poor productivity. At the moment, 6 in 10 UK professional services firms, but actually this is representative across lots of other industries too, are consistently reporting skill shortages, and in particular the demand is for technology consulting skills, where people are looking for skilled workers with strong critical thinking, analytical ability, and great communication skills. And in fact, research by the CBI, that's the Confederation for British Industry, has evidenced that skill shortages in the UK professional services sectors has actually hit its worst level in at least 19 years, which is when they started measuring it. So it is a real problem. And importantly, I think technology has got a role to play in attracting skilled workers. Some really interesting work, and I think there is a link to this in the downloads of the attachments to the webinar. The UK Work Foundation did a piece of work where they found that a third of all workers would choose flexible working over a pay rise. So I'm just going to say that again because I think it's quite important. A third of all workers would choose flexible working over a pay rise. And actually, when you look at millennials, that fraction goes up. And so, today, finding, attracting, and engaging a talented workforce that businesses need to be productive, they're calling it out as their top challenge and their top success factor. And so, delivering a personalised and compelling workplace experience is actually becoming really important to attracting and retaining the people that you really want. So So, in short, skill shortages, damaging productivity, and technology in its ability to deliver flexible and remote working is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I can certainly relate to that in terms of how we work at Teleware. I think it's changed enormously over the last couple of years in terms of that requirement to work flexibly. But could you just tell me a little bit more about how the lack of flexibility goes on to create poor productivity?
Yeah, sure. I think actually before I go into that, let's just sort of set where the bar is. Since 2008, since the financial crash, the growth of productivity in the UK has absolutely collapsed. Today, the UK is less productive than our main competitors, and that's particularly France, Germany, and America, where we're about a third less productive than those other countries. And Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England, he did some research into the UK's productivity problem, and he produced a paper called The Productivity Puzzle, and he's just released an update. It's a talk he did around the productivity, and it's really interesting. So I think, again, that's attached to the attachments and links to the webinar. I would encourage people to have a look because there's a lot of important information in there. And for me, one of the most surprising findings is that only 1% of UK businesses are what the bank would classify as productive.
Wow.
So we've got a long way to go, and the government is taking this problem seriously. Last year, it set up a productivity commission chaired by Sir Charlie Mayfield, who's the chairman of John Lewis, and its aim is basically to encourage businesses to measure productivity against benchmarks for their own industry, and then share best practice so that we can all learn from each other. And the reason they took this approach is that this method was absolutely key to the success of the financial services sector, sharing benchmark data, learning from each other. And there's a website now for the Productivity Commission, which is bethebusiness.com, where you can go and look at data across your sector and see how you fit in terms of productivity. So there's a lot happening. There's a lot happening about it to help us improve.
Yeah, I think, Lucy, that's really interesting. One of the things that's sort of a common theme in productivity is that as we've moved more to being a service-driven economy, how do you measure productivity in service industry? It was very easy in the old manufacturing industries. It was inputs and outputs, but particularly where you're looking at things like financial services and professional services, one of the key things is how that is a problem for people is how do you actually measure that productivity?
Yeah, and this, these activities, Andy Haldane's come up with some really interesting ways of measuring productivity of services businesses, and also that there are services sectors on Be the Business. So we are collectively trying to see where we all are, see who's doing well, and see how we can learn so that everybody can improve, because it's such an important thing that we need to do for our future success.
Wonderful. So, Lucy, you just touched on the fact that there is an attachment with the links to the references that you're talking about. So, if you are interested in finding out more about any of the points that any of the presenters make today, then do open that attachment, and you can just click on the relevant links there. So, thank you very much for that, Lucy. So, one of the things I'm aware of from my research is around presenteeism. So this is where employees are feeling that they need to be available and in the office even when they're not well enough to be in the office, which I know that this is a problem that's been impacting productivity for a number of years. But how is this playing out in the current climate with the current productivity crisis? And do millennials view this differently to Generation X or baby boomers?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer your second question first about the difference between Generation X and baby boomers. There's been a lot of work done around this, and basically the nub of it is that the younger people, our millennials, they watch their parents, work very long hours, at work, and they don't want that. They want a better work-life balance, and so that's why they work differently and they see work differently. So work is, it's that famous adage: work is something you do, not somewhere you go. And particularly, if you're on a creative job, you may be creative at 3 o'clock in the morning, and a millennial in that instance is more likely to get up and capture that creativity than worry about going back to sleep and getting up early and getting into the office. So there is that fundamental difference. But then in terms of this, people thinking they've got to be in the office, we call it presenteeism. Cambridge University did a massive study across all sectors of the UK, and they found that workers lose about 30 days of productive time every year due to sick days or underperformance in the office. And so that's effectively, every worker losing 6 working weeks of productive time every year. And then they also found that if you try and translate this into actual hard cash monetary terms, the economic impact of this, ill health related absence, but then people going into work when they're ill, which is about 28 days a year. People are going to work when they're ill, and that's costing the country or our economy £77.5 billion a year, which is a staggering number. And then if I come back to the point I was making earlier about remote and flexible working, well, the UK Work Foundation has measured this too, and they've shown that if you allow people to work remotely and flexibly, it improves their well-being by about 54%, which is significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally relate to that. So basically, what you're saying is we've got a skill shortage, we've got a problem with presenteeism, and we've got poor productivity. Is this a killer combination?
Yeah, it is, and it's impacting different industries in different ways. It's kind of almost inevitable that the problems are interlinked. If you can't get people to do work, then your productivity is going to go down. If you've got people coming to work when they're not fit to work, their productivity is going to go down. So, it's understandable. But actually, when you start to look at the impact this is having on industry, it gets really quite alarming. So in the last 12 months, 67% of British law firms have claimed that skill shortages are threatening their growth. 20% of these firms are then calling out keeping the employees they've got, staff retention, as their second biggest challenge. Excuse me, I'm doing a bit of presenteeism here today. I've got a sore throat, so I do hope. Please excuse me. So we've got these problems with attracting and keeping people, but actually the good thing is that only 2 in 10 law firms offer flexible remote working. So there is an opportunity in that sector for them to use that kind of technology and make an impact on their productivity. And it isn't just law firms. 1 in 2 financial services firms are worried about finding the skills they need. It's their top issue for this year. 6 in 10 banks are reporting a moderate to extreme skill shortage. And 8 in 10 insurance brokers have reported a shortage of technical skills in their businesses this year. And if you just look back just over 12 months ago, that was 60%. So it's jumped 20% in just over a year.
Okay, wow. So there's lots of challenges out there, but out of challenges come opportunities. So Vicky, I'm going to bring you in here if that's okay. So, is this something that you and your colleagues at Microsoft recognised, and what are some of the things that Microsoft are doing to help?
Absolutely, and just to loop in there something that Lucy closed on. So I look after some of our largest financial services institutions in the UK, and we're focused on a digital transformation agenda and strategy. And as a millennial, if I may refer to myself as that for the purposes of this session, it was quite staggering to me the heritage technology that we've got in some of these organisations as I've approached this digital transformation agenda with them. So as Microsoft, what we're doing is we're absolutely undertaking what we call modern workplace reviews now. So we have a whole heap of technology that can help engage colleagues of all levels, but certainly create a culture that fosters skills and collaboration, and give millennials parity of experience with the consumer products that they use. It shouldn't be in 2018 such a disparate gap between the technology that they use in day-to-day life and then the equipment that they're provided to do, whether it's a highly skilled job or, whatever it is that they require. Their expectation is high. As a colleague, when tech doesn't work, we can all share on this webinar that it's frustrating. But for the millennial who's used to things, accessing their data everywhere, being able to work wherever, that's thoroughly annoying. So we're working really hard to work with organisations, and we're increasingly having disparate conversations now that are no longer about IT. It's absolutely about culture and people. So we speak to HR directors around that flexible working approach. How can they create a work-life balance for their employees to retain, foster and grow the correct talent that their organisation needs to be successful?
Okay, so thinking about you specifically, how big a factor was technology in your decision to join Microsoft?
Yeah, it's absolutely part of the due diligence that I would do in any interview process now. The tools that I'll be provided, what's the work-life balance, the flexibility that I'll be afforded to perform my role, it all absolutely influences the decision. We talked earlier about flexible working being higher priority to salary. And for me, it forms such a crucial part of the due diligence when approaching the next steps in my career, and has done actually. It has done for some time now.
Interesting. So Lucy, just to come back to you for a second. So listening to what Vicky's just said, and from the information that you've already shared today, what does it all mean for employers?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that you need to put yourself in a position where your organisation can offer your workers the choice of either using their own device or a business-owned device with the right facilities on it that enables them to be as productive in their work life as they are in their personal life. If I share a story of this is chief executive of an IT company, and his son was looking for a very bright young man, but he was looking for an organisation to join, and during his degree, he was using all of the latest collaboration software, online storage, cloud applications. He'd got his mobile phone integrated across, all of those facilities that he was using. So he was able to be super productive. And he really struggled, just to endorse what Vicky said, he really struggled to find an organisation that could help him work like that at work in the same way that he'd done in his personal life and at college.
Yeah. So that's really, really interesting story, and I can see that happening. So just building on that point a little bit, Andrew, around some of the differences around millennials. So I know that you're just outside the millennial age bracket, but what differences are you seeing? Are you seeing us come to the fore as millennials become the dominant working generation?
I think one thing to sort of bear in mind is, particularly we've sort of seen some really fundamental changes in the nature of work, and particularly the idea of actually having a job for life obviously is no longer. But even beyond that, you're seeing the gig economy coming through, and with the gig economy, many millennials sort of expect to actually be working simultaneously for more than one organisation, so almost sort of a freelance relationship with their employees. If you look at organisations that are pretty progressive, like Virgin, they did a very interesting exercise quite recently where they held what they called a corporate day. And they asked its employees to behave in the way that more traditional firms require for just a day, as sort of almost a role play thing. So the staff were required to wear sort of formal business clothes. They had to arrive very promptly at 9 a.m. They had to use the titles Mr. and Mrs. when talking to each other. They didn't have the freedom to look at social media at work. And they weren't allowed to use their own mobiles or make personal calls during the working day on this corporate day. And I think Richard Branson summed it up afterwards at the end and basically just called it a horrible experience for everybody. And I think that sort of says how much we've moved on in terms of sort of working styles. And the new generation of workers purely, this is a given, this is an acceptance in there. So skilled millennials in particular now demand a workplace which gives them a lot more flexibility. So the ability to dress down is a very simple one. Use their own technology, as Vicky was saying earlier. Work from home or even work part-time to accommodate other interests in their lives. And take unpaid leave as and when they wish. And a lot of surveys have shown that millennial workers aren't actually motivated by the same factors that maybe the older generation assume that they are. So work-life balance, hugely more important, and millennials are much more sort of purpose-driven, and that purpose goes way beyond sort of the very crude and simple measures of financial success. So as employers, with the challenges that Lucy mentioned earlier, employers really need to shift the working practices quite urgently to attract and retrain staff and retain staff from this generation. And Steve Tappin, who's a bit of a guru in this area from an organisation called Zinfu, there's a quote from him. He said, "If CEOs try and over-control in the old way, then millennials will walk. But if you can harness their ideas, passion and energy, then that's going to power future success." So I think that's a really good sort of summary of this cultural shift that's needed, particularly in some more traditional businesses. This has hit the headlines quite recently within the last couple of months. PwC made a lot of news by allowing the workers to choose literally their own working patterns. And Anne Donovan, who's PwC's human capital transformation leader, how's that for a job title, said she first noticed something around 8 years ago, and new employees were only staying a year or two before quitting. They were no longer receptive to the old deal that the longer they stayed, the more marketable they would be. She's seen much more flexibility, much more flow in the workforce. And the initial reaction to that was, well, we must be hiring the wrong people. So they actually did a study of PwC's own workforce, looking specifically at its younger workers, and the results of that were really blindingly clear that this new generation wanted to work differently, and they weren't hanging around to wait for things to change. They would move to the environment which best suited them and in which they could be more productive, rather than waiting for the organisation to change. So from a human resources perspective, there's some real challenges there. So in summary, a lot of it's about working in a very purpose-driven way, working regardless of location, and using technology, the technology that the generation has been brought up with, to its full to allow this new style of work. So it's now about rather than work-life balance, which is a term that's been in use for a long time, it's about truly blending work and life for these millennial workers. And organisations such as PwC have become very enlightened with this are going to be those that win.
I think it's really interesting what PwC have done, and by kind of taking a very proactive approach to that, they've been able to get a lot of coverage on the back of it, and they're seen as being a very progressive employer on the back of some of the things that they're doing. So Vicky, just to bring you into that point, and so are you seeing it playing out with some of the customers that you're working with in terms of how they're addressing changing expectations amongst their workers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that PwC example is leading the fore with what we're seeing the change curve of other organisations that they're going through. Millennials, they're not mannequins for window dressing. It's not about having a diverse workforce, inverted commas. These really are the skills and the talent for the future. And we're seeing that organisations are they're focused on the cultural change that's required, and then the impact that technology can have. Giving the right tools to these individuals to perform at their best, to be the most collaborative, to be the most productive, to enable a work-life balance for millennials of my age now with young children that are, keen to remain in the workforce and not have a year out to be on maternity leave and re-engage with their employer and continue to be engaged with their employer. It's the only way that they're going to retain the top skill and talent, and I think that realisation has hit home now. And our expectations are high. We do our due diligence, and we are seeing certainly the conversations within my customer base that the demographic is really shifting. We're truly having meaningful conversations that are delivering outputs for the colleagues to enable them to be better at what they do, and focus on the customer's customer. Okay, so if you enable your colleagues to be their most productive, then your customers will get a better service, whether that's their internal customers or whether that's the external customers. The benefit is a win-win all round.
Okay, so I've got a question for all of you. So, sorry, Lucy, go on.
It's just we've got a few questions from the audience. Before we move on, could we just pick up? There's one about dressing down in the workplace. And so before we just move on, to answer that, there is a lot more acceptance of dressing down in the workplace across the board. But I think the real answer to this, and this member of our audience, the question is, do you think dressing down in the workplace makes a business look lightweight when dealing with professional customers? I think you should always dress professionally with a jacket and a tie. And I think the answer to that is to know your customer, because there are some very big organisations that are very relaxed about people coming without jackets and without ties, and there are other organisations that really need it. And so I think that's the key there is to be able to adapt to what your customer expects.
I think as well as customers have got younger, as well as staff, obviously their expectations change. So my children, for instance, when they go into a business meeting, they would probably feel fairly negative about a very strict dress code in there. And so I think it's about being sensitive to the environment and your customers, and like I say, really dressing appropriately. It really is as simple as that.
And did you have a view on that, Vicky?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a time and a place. So I referred to earlier, I look after some of the UK's largest financial institutions, and we're making huge progress with their digital transformation from a technology perspective. But there's still certainly an expectation of the way I will dress when I attend their offices and the way that they expect of each other to dress. And that's fine if the expectation is understood. And it comes all the way back to that know your customer. As Microsoft, we have quite an informal policy. Smart casual, a little bit vague. It's the dreaded smart casual when you put that on an invite, but it's not shirt and tie, certainly. But that doesn't detract for the reason that we're all there and the way that we'll perform in the day-to-day.
Okay. Interesting. I think and there's a lot of subjectivity involved in that, so some people have got their own views about how they want to perceive themselves or be perceived. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting subject.
Yeah, I think one of the things there is a lot of this, it's about balance, isn't it? And that balance can swing one way or another. There was sort of a few years ago, Marissa Mayer at Yahoo, who had probably gone completely towards sort of a very, very informal, ultra-flexible workplace. She felt it necessary actually with Yahoo, who are obviously a technology company, to sort of rein them in to some extent and demand that they were in an office for a period of time because communication was starting to suffer. And like I say, so it's really about a balance. It isn't one or the other. It's about applying the blend of working styles that actually suits your organisation, suits its employees, and suits its customers.
Yeah. So.
And we've got sorry, Mark, but we've got two other questions as well. Do you want to come to those at the end?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to those, Lucy, if that's all right, because I wanted to go on to Andrew and ask him a little bit more about the technology, to get into some more of the specifics around the technologies that you're seeing businesses adopt that are helping to attract more millennials and helping to address the skills shortage and productivity issues.
Yeah, so obviously you can't talk about technology in the workplace without the ubiquitous smartphone, which, well, it's only really been with us in the true sense for 10 or 15 years, has completely changed the way we sort of think about work. And there's a lot of evidence now that even your sort of traditional laptop and desktop computers are now being replaced as the tool of choice by convertible and hybrid tablet devices, and of course the smartphone, which has the power and can do many of the things that were more sort of desk-bound previously. And that feeds in obviously to the ability to work mobile, given that the devices are increasingly connectable and connected using high-speed mobile broadband technology. The other thing that's coming are the new sort of the app mechanism, the app ecosystems, and you're seeing traditional business tools, ERP, CRM tools, now come down to the smartphone. So things like Salesforce, the client apps to communicate, to work with, are all pretty much caught up and in some cases actually more functional from a practical standpoint than the desktop equivalents. So we're increasingly seeing organisations within our area, which is particularly in the sort of communications field, we're seeing organisations now really beginning to look at ditching desk phones for smartphones, bring your own device, even in some areas that you wouldn't expect it. So some very traditional areas of finance and banking, bring your own device. We're working with a large financial organisation at the moment who is switching over to bring your own device and using some of the latest teleware tools to actually do that in a controlled and responsive fashion. The nature of the devices is changing as well. You see on the screen there some of the more advanced sort of concept devices, these rollable screens, wearable devices. We're at the early stage of adoption of those, and they will evolve and they will find a place alongside the smartphone and the desktop computer. From a teleware standpoint, we've recently launched our own recall app, which removes the inconvenience of actually needing to carry two devices. It's often really quite amusing to be on a commuter train and look at the physical number of devices and chargers and that people are carrying. So most people carrying 2 phones, some carrying a laptop as well, some carrying even a tablet device as well. And I think we'll see a big rationalisation in that as the smartphone actually becomes the preferred and sort of central place where people do their own work. You've also got new capabilities coming in, video-based collaboration, transcription of things like calls is an area that we're doing a lot of interesting work in, which can take out a lot of the sort of manual work in recording things like meetings, in making sure that agreements are stuck to even when they're verbal agreements. So there's a lot of technology in there. The thing that needs to be thought about is how that meets the individual employee's preferred working style. Many organisations are now taking what's called a mobile-first approach. So the first place they look to deploy an application now is on a mobile device rather than on a desktop device, and that can have a huge impact in the efficiency of an organisation. If a salesperson, for instance, can take an order online, it can save 2 or 3 weeks in delivering a product to a customer and delivering revenue to the employer. So these things are going to increasingly have a direct impact on productivity.
So just building on that point for productivity for a second, and thinking about what's just been said over the last couple of minutes, as Lucy said, we've had a number of questions coming in. One that's standing out to me that I wanted to ask all of you is around so-called blended working. So it seems massively open to abuse by millennials and could give a HR nightmare with staff being in notified absence. So which goes down as blended working. So it's basically kind of, if employers are going to take a more flexible approach to working and accept the fact that people are going to be working whenever and however they want to work, how do they help to manage potential for that to be abused by staff? And it's not necessarily just millennials, it could be anybody.
Yeah. Well, businesses need different ways of managing, particularly younger people, and I would point the audience back to the UK Work Foundation paper. They found that well over half of the UK companies that try to implement flexible and mobile working are failing, and they're failing because they haven't got the right policies, and so you need a different management approach, which is more based on outcomes rather than time-based objectives. And there's some very insightful and good advice in that paper, and that also picks up the other question, which is, if millennials are difficult to control or pin down, how is the boss supposed to apply certain rules? Well, it requires a completely different management approach, and actually different HR policies where the rules are clear, and what matters most is what your workers are delivering for your business, not necessarily when and how they deliver it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the focus there needs to move towards sort of outputs and really meaningful outputs that employees understand that is their responsibility. So it's a shift from the responsibility of actually being physically present at a place to actually delivering the outputs that your business requires, having really clearly set objectives which are measurable, are real, and can be policed.
It's quite a big attitudinal shift as well, isn't it, for employers, particularly if they've grown up in a very different working environment themselves, to actually be able to kind of trust, I suppose, that the outputs are going to be delivered at the end of the day, whatever that day looks like. Yeah,
and I think as Lucy says, so far, let's be honest, it's not going well. I think most of the early experience of moving towards flexible working, there's been some real tram smashes there that people have had to back out of because they haven't put the right policies in place, they haven't understood the cultural impact, and they haven't understood the need for some very new and advanced technologies to support these new ways of working.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. So, Andrew, kind of just coming back to you, what are the kind of the top 5 things that you think firms should be doing today to address the skills gap and to help them increase productivity?
Yeah, so slightly tongue in cheek, but I think the first thing to note when working with millennials is let's stop calling them millennials. I know we've fallen into that trap here, but I think going forward, if these people are 75% of the workforce, we don't call them millennials anymore. We call them the workforce. These are now very much the sort of mainstream workers. There's a lot of sensitivity, as Mark mentioned earlier, around the term millennial, and you need to be sort of very careful about sort of compartmentalising sectors of your workforce and actually making big sweeping assumptions about them. So once you've stopped calling them millennials, the next thing really is to understand exactly where your organisation sits on the sort of maturity scale in terms of its working practice and working environment. And here I think it's really important that you bring the new and the younger employees into the conversation. PwC, who we mentioned earlier, they did a lot of work in sort of really getting to grips with and understanding their new and younger workers, and really understanding the preferred working styles, the sort of tools that they were wanting to bring into the workplace. And once you've done that, you can begin to identify a number of quick wins and sort of functional areas of your business in which you can use the new technology to simplify process, accelerate process. And from then on, really, it's going to be a case of creating that work environment which sort of welcomes that style of working with the effective use of technology. And things you need to consider there is bring your own device appropriate? May not always be for many organisations, particularly in heavily regulated industries. Obviously, there are a lot of security risks with bringing your own device. So you need to think about not only workers bringing their own devices, but bringing their own software tools. Things like Slack, the latest sort of generation of workflow technologies. Many younger workers are expecting to have that in the workplace or equivalent tools, such as the sort of Microsoft Teams I've got to mention before Vicky kicks me under the table, in order to sort of enforce that new cultural way of working. And it's about access to communication and access to the information people need to do the jobs. It's very much an at your fingertips type of piece. So when we think of millennials and sort of almost the stereotypical media view, it's not about the sort of ping pong tables, the drink fridges, or the chair massages that keep young employees in a business. The evidence is that these perks are great. When you go for your interview, you'll notice them. But it's not what make people stay in a progressive business. You must nurture a company culture that shows through in the workplace, is absolutely real from that sense, and where employees feel a sense of camaraderie. And time again in the research that's been done, that's what keeps millennials happy. It's this teamwork, continuing progress, freedom to use the latest tools, device flexibility, and work mobility. And that will be more important than the salary check, more and more as we look at the millennials becoming the mainstream part of the workforce. The final piece, and sort of plays into particularly the sort of teleware experience, is you need to look at communication. Always comes out as one of the main challenges of businesses. And a typical millennial employee will switch their attention between devices and channels 27 times an hour. I think it's worth just reflecting on that. 27 times each hour, a millennial employee will flip between a different medium. It's this sort of very, very much sort of multitasking environment. Things like email do still have a role, but for millennial workers, far less natural and far less effective as a communication tool. And the generation that's been brought up with social media channels, collaborative, video-enabled, instant messaging tools are much more natural to bring into the workplace. And if you're not providing these, you're not going to be getting the best out of the workforce. In a recent study, 64% of candidates were seen to ask about social media policies and usage during the recruitment process. So it's a really big thing for the people that you're interviewing, what your organisation and policies are around this, and you need to be really clear and really consistent around it. And that is a factor in attracting the most skilled and the best employees.
Thanks for that, Andrew. So we're kind of starting to run out of time. So to wrap things up, I'm going to come to each of you and ask you the exam question, if you like. So Lucy, first of all, so could millennials be the key to ending the current productivity crisis?
Yes, I think they can. They are able to be very productive in their own personal lives using technology, and I think if businesses can enable them to bring these skills into the workplace, adapting the way that businesses work in terms of the policies they have, the way they measure people and the technology they provide, that they will accelerate their productivity above organisations that don't.
Vicky, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, those organisations that equip, enable and energise millennials will see the best results. And the second part of that is those organisations that embrace digital transformation will be the most successful. This is cultural and this is technology driven. And those organisations that view it through those lenses will have the greatest success in growing talent internally and attracting the best talent in their particular industry.
Andrew, do you concur?
Yeah, I do. I think it's an enormous challenge, perhaps the biggest challenge we've got in sort of transforming the workplace. And I think there's a real need for the organisations that are doing this right really to start shouting off the rooftops about the success stories and setting themselves up as exemplars. And you've seen with organisations like PwC, a number of sort of leading thought leadership people coming through and actually saying, this is how to do it, this is how it works, these are some of our experience, and share the bad as well as the good, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much to all of the expert panelists today. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. Hopefully it's provided some useful information to the audience. Couple of things before we do wrap up. First of all, there are on our Bright Talk channel, there are a number of previous webinars that you can go on and view at your own leisure. So do take a look at some of those things. Andrew talked a little bit about recall earlier, so we've got a video that explains recall in a little bit more detail, so that's loaded up onto the Bright Talk channel as well. And in fact, we have got an Ask the Experts webinar coming up on the 15th of October at 11 a.m. So where we'll be discussing how recall can help your business improve employee mobility in much more detail. So if that's of interest to you, register today, and you'll be kept informed about reminders and so on about that webinar coming up. And yeah, so one last thing is the references slide is available as a download. So if you haven't already, do take a look at that and access the information that Lucy referred to earlier. So thank you, audience. Thank you, everybody who's listened to today's webinar. Hopefully you found that useful. And thank you, everybody who's taken part on the panel today. Really appreciate your time and speak to you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.